You are sitting at your kitchen table eating something you have eaten hundreds of times before. Something familiar? Something you have never thought twice about. Maybe it is your morning toast with butter. Maybe it is a bowl of canned soup. Maybe it is the orange juice you pour every single day because you have always been told it is healthy. And the entire time you're eating it, your cardiovascular system, your heart, your arteries, your capillaries, is receiving signals from that food that are either protecting it or quietly working against it. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you in your tracks. After 60, the way your cardiovascular system responds to food changes dramatically compared to how it responded at 40 or 50. Foods that were relatively harmless earlier in life become significantly more problematic. Foods that your body used to handle easily now trigger inflammation, arterial stiffness, and circulation problems that build silently over months and years before they announce themselves as something serious. 7 specific foods that are sitting in the kitchens of millions of Americans right now are doing exactly this. And most of the people eating them have no idea, because nobody has ever explained what happens to the aging heart and circulation system when those foods show up repeatedly on the plate. That changes today. Stay right here, because this is one of the most important conversations you can have about your health after 60. Welcome. If you are new to this channel, I am glad you are here. This is Dr. Alex Morgan, JAS Aging Wellness Lab, and what we do here every week is take the real science of aging, the peer-reviewed, published research that most people never see, and translate it into honest, practical information you can use in your daily life. No scare tactics for the sake of clicks, no supplement pitches, just real information delivered with the seriousness it deserves. If that is the kind of content you want more of, please subscribe right now and give this video a like before we go any further. It helps this information reach the people who need it most, and today's topic is one that I genuinely believe every person over 60 needs to hear. Now let us get into the biology first, because once you understand what is actually happening in your cardiovascular system as you age, these 7 foods will make complete and sobering sense. After 60, your cardiovascular system is operating in a fundamentally different physiological environment than it was 20 years ago. Several changes happen simultaneously and compound each other in ways that increase vulnerability to dietary harm. The arterial walls stiffen, a process called arteriosclerosis, which is different from atherosclerosis and which happens to virtually everyone with age, regardless of their cholesterol levels. Stiff arteries cannot expand and contract as efficiently with each heartbeat, which means the heart has to work harder to push blood through the circulatory system. Blood pressure tends to rise as a result. The endothelium, the single-cell thick lining of your blood vessels that regulates inflammation, blood clotting, and vascular tone, becomes less functional with age, less able to produce nitric oxide, and more prone to inflammatory signaling. The kidneys, which play a critical role in regulating fluid balance and blood pressure, become less efficient at filtering and excreting certain compounds. And the inflammatory baseline of the body, the background level of systemic inflammation that exists even in the absence of obvious illness, rises, creating a pro-inflammatory environment in which the cardiovascular system is chronically stressed. In this changed physiological context, foods that the body could previously process without significant consequence become genuinely problematic. The threshold for harm is lower, the recovery capacity is reduced, and the cumulative effect of repeated dietary insults on an already stressed cardiovascular system is significantly greater than it was at younger ages. This is the core reason why dietary guidance that is appropriate for a 40-year-old is not automatically appropriate for someone who is 65 or 70. The body has changed, and the nutritional approach needs to reflect that change. Let us start with the first food, and this one is going to surprise a lot of people because it has been marketed as healthy for decades, and that is commercial fruit juice, including orange juice, apple juice, and virtually every other fruit juice sold in a bottle or carton. Here is the problem. When you eat a whole piece of fruit, the fiber in that fruit does something critically important. It slows the absorption of the fruit's natural sugars into your bloodstream, creating a gradual, manageable rise in blood glucose. When you juice that fruit and remove the fiber, you are left with essentially a sugar solution. The natural sugars in fruit juice, primarily fructose, enter the bloodstream rapidly and in concentrated form. And fructose, unlike glucose, is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver. When the liver receives a large dose of fructose in a short period of time, it converts a significant portion of it into triglycerides, blood fats, which are then released into the circulation. Elevated triglycerides are an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and they are particularly problematic in the context of the already elevated inflammatory baseline of an older adult. A 12-ounce glass of orange juice contains roughly the same amount of sugar as a can of soda, and without the fiber that would slow its absorption, the metabolic effect is comparable. After 60, insulin sensitivity decreases for most people, meaning the body becomes less efficient at managing blood sugar spikes. This is why many older adults develop what doctors call impaired fasting glucose or prediabetes, not because they are suddenly eating worse, but because their metabolic machinery has shifted. Every spike in blood glucose and triglycerides from a glass of fruit juice is a small cardiovascular stress event. Repeated daily over months and years, those stress events accumulate in the arterial wall as inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and progressive plaque. The solution is not to avoid fruit. Eat the whole fruit and get all the fiber and phytonutrients that come with it. But retire the fruit juice habit, especially in the morning when it is most commonly consumed and when the body is coming off an overnight fast with particularly heightened glucose sensitivity. The second food is one that is deeply embedded in American food culture, and that will be genuinely difficult for many people to hear. And that is processed deli meats. Sliced turkey, ham, roast beef, salami, bologna. The entire category of cured and processed meats that make up the filling of the most common American lunch. The cardiovascular concern here is not primarily the fat content, which is where most people focus. It is the sodium content, the nitrate content, and the advanced glycation end products that form during the curing and processing of these meats. Starting with sodium, a standard 2-ounce serving of deli turkey contains between 400 and 700 milligrams of sodium, depending on the brand. The daily sodium recommendation for adults over 50 from the American Heart Association is no more than 1,500 milligrams. 2 slices of deli meat can represent nearly half that entire daily budget in a single sandwich filling. In older adults whose kidneys are less efficient at excreting excess sodium, the blood pressure response to high sodium intake is greater than in younger people, a phenomenon called salt sensitivity that becomes more prevalent with age. Chronically elevated blood pressure is the single most modifiable risk factor for stroke and heart failure, and processed meats are one of the most concentrated sources of dietary sodium in the typical American diet. The nitrates and nitrites used as preservatives in most cured meats present a separate concern. Under certain conditions, particularly in the presence of high heat during cooking or in the acidic environment of the stomach, nitrates can be converted to nitrosamines, which are compounds that have been classified as probable human carcinogens and that also generate oxidative stress in vascular tissue. Multiple large epidemiological studies, including the landmark NIH AARP Diet and Health Study, have found significant associations between processed meat consumption and increased cardiovascular mortality, with the association stronger in older age groups than in younger ones. The third food is something that most people think of as a neutral, benign carbohydrate staple: white bread and refined grain products. Bagels, white rice, regular pasta, crackers, most commercial cereals. The issue here connects directly to the insulin sensitivity decline we discussed earlier. Refined grains have had their fiber, bran, and germ removed during processing, leaving essentially pure starch that converts to glucose in your bloodstream extremely rapidly. In a young, metabolically healthy person, the pancreas responds to this glucose surge with a robust insulin response that clears the glucose efficiently. In an older adult with reduced insulin sensitivity, the glucose surge is larger, the insulin response is slower and less efficient, and the resulting period of elevated blood glucose is longer. This prolonged hyperglycemia, even at levels below what would officially qualify as diabetic, causes direct damage to the endothelium through a process called glycation, where glucose molecules attach to proteins in the blood vessel wall and impair their function. This is one of the primary mechanisms through which blood sugar dysregulation damages arteries, and it is happening at levels that most standard blood tests would not flag as concerning. At Dr. Alex Morgan, Brickstage Aging Wellness Lab, we think about cardiovascular risk not just in terms of the dramatic events, the heart attack, the stroke, but in terms of the daily, cumulative, microscopic processes that build toward those events over years and decades. Every meal of refined carbohydrates consumed by an older adult with reduced insulin sensitivity is a small installment payment on an arterial damage account. Switching to whole grain alternatives, whole grain bread, brown rice, legumes, oats, provides fiber that slows glucose absorption, phytonutrients that reduce vascular inflammation, and a completely different metabolic response that protects rather than stresses the cardiovascular system. The fourth food is one that many seniors eat specifically because they believe it is heart healthy, and it is in its natural form, but in one specific preparation that is extraordinarily common in American households, it becomes a cardiovascular concern. That food is margarine, and foods made with partially hydrogenated oils, also known as trans fats. Now, it is important to acknowledge that the FDA banned artificial trans fats from the food supply in 2018, and most manufacturers have reformulated their products accordingly. But here's where the problem persists. Many products still use intrasterified fats, a newer form of modified fat that was created to replace trans fats, whose long-term cardiovascular effects are still being studied and are not yet fully understood. And millions of households still have older products in their pantries, particularly baked goods, microwave popcorn, coffee creamers, and certain cooking sprays that were manufactured before the reformulation took full effect or that are still sold in certain markets with older formulations. Reading ingredient labels and looking specifically for the words partially hydrogenated is still a necessary habit, because even small amounts of trans fat, amounts too small to require label disclosure under current regulations, can have measurable effects on LDL cholesterol and arterial inflammation in older adults whose vascular systems have reduced resilience. The fifth food on this list is one that generates more confusion and more conflicting advice than almost any other dietary topic. And that is salt, or more precisely, the hidden sodium in restaurant meals and packaged foods beyond the obvious categories. Most people know that the salt shaker on the table is a sodium source. What they dramatically underestimate is how much sodium is already present in restaurant meals before a single shake of that shaker. A standard restaurant meal, not a fast food meal, a sit-down restaurant meal that appears relatively healthy, can contain anywhere from 1,500 to 4,000 milligrams of sodium. In a single meal, that is the entire daily recommended limit or more in one sitting. Chain restaurant soups, salads with dressing, grilled fish with sauce, vegetable sides with seasonings, all of these sound healthy, and all of them can be sodium delivery systems in disguise. The reason this matters so acutely after 60 returns to the kidney function decline we discussed earlier. Younger kidneys can excrete excess sodium relatively efficiently, limiting the duration of blood pressure elevation after a high sodium meal. Older kidneys excrete sodium more slowly, meaning the blood pressure elevation persists longer after each high sodium meal. For someone eating at restaurants frequently, which is increasingly common among older Americans who may be living alone, recently retired, or socially active in ways that involve dining out, this represents a chronic pattern of sodium exposure that the aging cardiovascular system simply is not equipped to handle without consequence. The solution is not to stop eating at restaurants. It is to develop specific habits, asking for sauces on the side, requesting reduced salt preparation, choosing broth-based soups over cream-based, and being strategic about frequency, that reduce the sodium load without eliminating the social pleasure of dining out. The sixth food is one that is genuinely beloved in American culture and that I want to discuss with nuance rather than alarm, and that is full-fat dairy in the form of cheese and butter consumed in significant daily quantities. Let me be precise here, because the relationship between saturated fat, dairy, and cardiovascular disease is more complex than it was presented even 10 years ago. The current science does not support the blanket condemnation of all saturated fat that dominated dietary guidelines for decades. Some saturated fats, particularly those in fermented dairy like cheese, appear to have neutral or even slightly beneficial cardiovascular effects in moderate consumption. Butter in reasonable amounts is not the cardiovascular villain it was once painted to be. The issue is quantity, frequency, and the specific context of the aging cardiovascular system. Full-fat dairy consumed in large quantities, multiple servings of cheese daily, butter used heavily at every meal, does raise LDL cholesterol in a meaningful subset of older adults, particularly those who are genetically predisposed to hyper-respond to dietary saturated fat. And in the context of already stiffened arteries, reduced endothelial function, and elevated inflammatory baseline, higher LDL creates greater risk than the same LDL level would in a younger, more resilient vascular system. This is not a reason to eliminate dairy. It is a reason to be thoughtful about portions, to prioritize fermented forms like yogurt and aged cheese over butter and cream, and to balance saturated fat intake with generous amounts of the unsaturated fats, olive oil, fatty fish, nuts, avocado, that have documented cardiovascular protective effects. The seventh food is one that catches people genuinely off guard because it carries such a healthy reputation, and that is canned vegetables and canned beans. Not because of the vegetables or beans themselves, those are among the most heart-protective foods available, but because of the liquid they are packed in. The majority of commercially canned vegetables and beans are packed in sodium-containing brine, and the sodium content can be surprisingly significant. A standard can of canned tomatoes can contain 400 to 500 milligrams of sodium. A can of chickpeas can contain 300 to 500 milligrams. Even canned corn, canned peas, and canned green beans, foods that seem completely innocuous, typically contain between 200 and 400 milligrams of sodium per serving when packed in conventional brine. For someone who is eating several servings of canned vegetables and beans per day, under the impression that they are eating heart healthily, the cumulative sodium intake can be substantial and working directly against the cardiovascular goals they think they are pursuing. The solution is simple and costs nothing extra. Buy no salt added versions of canned goods, which are now widely available in most major grocery chains, or drain and rinse conventional canned beans and vegetables under running water for 30 seconds before using them, which research has shown can reduce their sodium content by as much as 40%. These are small, effortless habit changes that preserve all the cardiovascular benefit of eating plants while eliminating the cardiovascular cost of the sodium they are packed in. This is the kind of granular, specific, actionable information that actually changes outcomes, and it is what we focus on every single week at Dr. Alex Morgan, NARS, AUS, Aging Wellness Lab. Now let me pull all of this together into a practical framework because I never want to leave you with a list of things to worry about without giving you a clear direction for what to do instead. The pattern that emerges from the research on cardiovascular protection after 60 is consistent and remarkably actionable. Replace fruit juice with whole fruit and water. Replace processed deli meats with home-cooked proteins, roasted chicken, canned salmon, hard-boiled eggs, legumes. Replace refined grain products with whole grain alternatives and root vegetables. Read labels on everything packaged and set a personal threshold of no more than 300 to 400 milligrams of sodium per serving for any packaged product you buy regularly. Moderate full-fat dairy and emphasize fermented forms. Choose no salt-added canned goods and rinse conventional ones. And when dining out, treat it as a special occasion sodium budget rather than a daily habit. None of this requires perfection. Cardiovascular health is not built or destroyed by individual meals. It is built or destroyed by patterns. The foods you reach for automatically, the habits you maintain without thinking, the daily defaults that add up to thousands of dietary decisions per year. Shifting those defaults, not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently and in the right direction, is what produces measurable differences in blood pressure, arterial flexibility, triglyceride levels, and inflammatory markers over months and years. These are differences that show up in lab work. They show up in how you feel walking up a flight of stairs. They show up in the energy you have at the end of the day. And they show up in the long-term risk trajectory that determines whether your later decades are spent in vitality or in the management of preventable cardiovascular disease. I want to say something sincerely before we close today. The reason I talk about these topics with the seriousness I do is not to generate fear. Fear is not a sustainable motivator, and it is not the culture of this channel. The reason I take this seriously is that the research is clear, the stakes are high, and most people genuinely do not have access to this level of specific, practical, age-appropriate nutritional information unless they have a particularly attentive physician or a nutrition specialist. Most people are making daily food decisions based on information that was designed for a younger body, marketed by an industry with financial interests, or inherited from habits formed decades ago. You deserve better information than that. And now you have it. Drop a comment below and tell me something honest. Which of these 7 foods surprised you the most? Was it the fruit juice? The canned vegetables? Or maybe you already knew about one of them and have been trying to cut back? I read these comments and I genuinely want to know where people are starting from because your answer shapes what I cover next. And if you know someone over 60, a parent, a sibling, a close friend, who you think is making any of these dietary mistakes without realizing it, please share this video with them today. Not as a criticism, but as a gift. Because this is exactly the kind of specific, actionable information that can redirect a health trajectory before it reaches a crisis point. That is why this channel exists, and that is why sharing this content matters. Subscribe if you have not already, take these 7 adjustments seriously, and I will see you in the next video at Dr. Alex Morgan, Chuck Aging Wellness Lab, where we will keep going deeper into everything. Your heart, your circulation, and your body need to stay strong and resilient for every year ahead.